For 6 weeks, a man crawled through 200 miles of wilderness with a shattered leg, exposed ribs, and a throat ripped open by a grizzly bear. Left for dead by the men he trusted, Hugh Glass had no map, no weapon, and no reason to believe his body could endure what his mind demanded. This is not a story about revenge, though rage sustained him. It is a story about the point where survival stops being instinct and becomes something closer to obsession. In 1823, on the edge of the American frontier, one man refused to die simply because 2 others decided he would. What he endured in those weeks would redefine the outer limits of human endurance. The upper Missouri River country in August of 1823 was not wilderness in the romantic sense. It was contested ground, carved into spheres of influence by Arikara war parties, rival fur trading companies, and the occasional military expedition that ventured west with more confidence than competence. Hugh Glass, a man somewhere in his 40s whose past remained deliberately vague, traveled with Major Andrew Henry's fur-trapping brigade as a hunter and scout. His job was simple: move ahead of the main party, locate game, assess threats, return with information. He had done this work for years across different frontiers. He understood the rhythms of danger, the calculus of risk. On this particular morning near the forks of the Grand River in present-day South Dakota, that understanding failed him completely. The grizzly bear was a female with cubs, the single most dangerous combination in North American wildlife. Glass had been pushing through dense brush along a creek bed, rifle cradled loosely, attention divided between tracks in the mud and the distant voices of his companions. The first indication of her presence was not sound, but impact. She covered the distance between them in seconds, a blur of muscle and fur, driven by the absolute conviction that he represented a threat to her young. There was no time to raise the rifle, no time to shout. The bear's weight, estimated later at over 400 pounds, drove him into the ground with enough force to crack ribs on both sides of his chest. Her claws, curved and unimaginably sharp, opened his back in parallel furrows. When he tried to roll away, she caught his throat. The wound was catastrophic. Her teeth punctured the soft tissue of his neck, narrowly missing the carotid artery, but tearing through muscle and possibly nicking his windpipe. Glass, operating on pure survival reflex, managed to draw his knife and stab repeatedly into the bear's body. The blade found purchase. She roared, released him momentarily, then returned with renewed fury. The attack lasted minutes, but felt endless, a chaos of blood, fur, and the wet sound of flesh separating. His companions, hearing the commotion, arrived with rifles raised. They shot the bear multiple times before she finally collapsed across Glass's legs, her weight pinning him to the earth even in death. When they pulled her off and examined Glass, the consensus was immediate and unanimous. He would not survive. The throat wound alone guaranteed that. Even if infection didn't take him, shock would. His breathing came in horrible, wet gasps. Blood pooled in the grass beneath him. Bone was visible through the torn flesh of his back. Major Henry, a practical man, accustomed to frontier mortality, made the only decision that seemed reasonable. The brigade could not stop. They were deep in hostile territory, with limited supplies and a schedule to keep. 2 men would stay with Glass until he died, then bury him and catch up with the main party. For this grim duty, Henry offered payment. A young man named Jim Bridger, barely 20 years old and new to the mountains, volunteered. An older trapper named John Fitzgerald joined him, motivated less from compassion than from the promised compensation. The brigade moved on. Bridger and Fitzgerald remained, sitting beside a dying man in a shallow depression they had scraped out as a preliminary grave. They waited 1 day, then 2. Glass did not die. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing ragged but persistent, his body refusing to acknowledge what his wounds insisted was inevitable. On the 3rd day, Fitzgerald began to argue that they had fulfilled their obligation. The Arikara were active in the area. Staying longer was suicide. Bridger, younger and more troubled by the ethics of abandonment, resisted initially, but eventually agreed. They took Glass's rifle, his knife, and his possibles bag, containing flint, steel, and other essentials. They did not kill him. They simply left him in the shallow grave, covered loosely with a blanket and bear hide, and walked away. When Hugh Glass opened his eyes fully hours later and understood what had happened, he was alone, unarmed, and more than 200 miles from Fort Kyawa, the nearest outpost of what could generously be called civilization. His body was a catalogue of trauma, but somewhere in the fever and pain, a decision formed. He would crawl to the fort, and when he arrived, he would find the men who left him. The initial movement was not crawling in any recognizable sense. It was dragging, a few inches at a time, using elbows and one functional leg, while the shattered limb trailed uselessly behind. Glass had no concept of distance, no plan beyond the next yard of ground. Thirst arrived first, a crushing immediacy that overrode even pain. There was a creek nearby, the same one where the bear had found him. Reaching it required most of a day. He drank directly from the stream, his torn throat making swallowing an exercise in agony, then collapsed in the mud and lost consciousness again. Time became meaningless. He woke, moved, drank, passed out. The pattern repeated without variation. His wounds, exposed to dirt and water, should have killed him through infection within days. They did not. Whether through robust constitution, blind luck, or some microbiological factor no one in 1823 could have understood, the worst of the lacerations began to crust over rather than fester. The throat wound remained the most dangerous, a ragged opening that whistled when he breathed and leaked fluid when he tried to consume anything beyond water. He could not eat solid food. He could barely produce sound. Speech was impossible. On the 4th or 5th day after abandonment, Glass encountered his first stroke of fortune, though fortune is perhaps the wrong word for finding a rotting buffalo carcass. The animal had died recently, likely from disease or old age, and scavengers had already begun the work of consumption. Vultures lifted heavily from the corpse as Glass approached, their wings laboring in the heat. The meat was spoiled, rank, barely recognizable as food. Glass tore strips away with his hands and forced them down, gagging on the texture and taste, but understanding that calories were survival. He vomited. He tried again. His stomach, empty for days, eventually accepted the offering. He remained near the carcass for 2 days, eating what he could tolerate, resting in short intervals, and making one critical decision about his body. The broken leg was not healing. It was swelling, the fracture misaligned in a way that would cripple him permanently if not addressed. Glass had no medical training, but he had seen bones set before. Using a straight piece of driftwood and strips torn from his shredded clothing, he positioned the leg as best he could judge, then bound the splint tightly. The pain was extraordinary, sufficient to trigger unconsciousness. When he woke, the leg was still bound. The alignment was imperfect, but it was better than before. He tested weight on it gingerly. The bone held. It would have to be enough. The real journey began after that. Glass oriented himself south and east,
following the general course of the Grand River toward its eventual confluence with the Missouri. He had traveled this country before, not extensively, but enough to hold a rough mental map of landmarks and river systems. The Missouri would lead to Fort Kyawa. The distance was staggering, but the alternative was death where he lay. So he moved. A mile some days, less on others. He crawled when the leg would not bear weight. He hobbled when it would. He used branches as improvised crutches, discarding them when they broke and fashioning new ones from whatever materials the landscape provided. Food came sporadically and never reliably. He ate berries when he found them, turnips dug from prairie dog burrows, and once, memorably, he reached a fresh kill before the wolves that had made it could return. The deer was still warm. Glass cut into it with a sharp rock, eating the liver raw, then carved away as much meat as he could carry. He had no way to preserve it, no means to make fire. Everything had to be consumed immediately or abandoned. The waste haunted him less than the hunger. Water was easier. The rivers and streams that cut through the plains provided consistent hydration, though dysentery was a constant threat. Glass drank carefully, choosing flowing water over stagnant pools when possible, but his standards dropped as thirst dictated. He contracted intestinal illness more than once, losing precious fluids through fever and diarrhea, but each time his body recovered enough to continue. Refusal, it seemed, could outlast pathogens. The psychological battle was harder to document, but no less real. Glass spoke aloud frequently, not to himself, but to the men who had abandoned him. He rehearsed the words he would say when he found them, refined accusations and demands that grew more elaborate with each mile. These one-sided conversations served a purpose beyond venting rage. They kept his mind active, prevented the dangerous inward spiral that accompanies total isolation. He sang fragments of songs, cursed in English and other languages, and occasionally laughed at the absurdity of his situation. The laughter sounded wrong, wet and rattling from his damaged throat, but it was human noise in an indifferent landscape. Weeks passed. The leg healed badly, leaving him with a permanent limp but functional mobility. The throat wound closed into a thick scar, a grotesque reminder visible to anyone who looked at him. His body, already lean from frontier life, became skeletal, but he moved south, mile after mile, through grasslands and river valleys, past Lakota hunting camps he avoided through luck and caution, across terrain that should have contained his bones, but instead became merely difficult rather than impossible. By late September, nearly 6 weeks after the mauling, Hugh Glass reached the Cheyenne River. Fort Kyawa was close now, perhaps 40 miles. For the first time since waking in that shallow grave, he allowed himself to believe he might actually arrive. What waited for him there, however, would prove that survival and justice were not the same thing.
Fort Kyawa stood on the west bank of the Missouri River, a collection of rough-hewn log structures surrounded by a wooden palisade designed more for psychological comfort than genuine defense. It served primarily as a trading post where French voyageurs, American trappers, and various indigenous nations exchanged pelts, goods, and information. When Hugh Glass limped through the gate in early October of 1823, he looked less like a man than a specter. His clothing hung in tatters. His body was emaciated, held together by scar tissue and will. The fort's inhabitants stared in disbelief, then recognition, then something approaching horror. Glass had been reported dead.
His name had already entered the informal oral history of the fur trade as another casualty of the wild country, mourned briefly and forgotten quickly. The first question everyone asked was how he had survived. Glass provided answers, but no comfort. He described the crawl in flat, factual terms, omitting nothing about the pain or the degradation. He did not dramatize. He did not need to. The wounds visible on his body testified with more authority than any story. The second question, posed more carefully, was what he intended to do now. Glass's answer was unambiguous. He would find Fitzgerald and Bridger. He would reclaim what they had stolen, and then, the subtext implied, there would be a reckoning. Fort Kyawa's factor, the man responsible for trade and relations, provided Glass with basic supplies, a rifle, powder, shot, a knife, and clothing adequate for the approaching winter. He also provided information. Major Henry's brigade had moved on to establish a fort on the Yellowstone River, hundreds of miles to the northwest. Fitzgerald and Bridger were presumably with them. The distance was staggering, the route dangerous. Glass had just survived an ordeal that should have been impossible. Most men would have considered the account settled, the survival itself a victory sufficient to end the matter. Glass was not most men. He rested at Fort Kyawa for less than a week. His body needed more time, but his obsession required movement. Other trappers warned him that winter was coming, that traveling alone through Lakota and Crow territory in freezing conditions was suicidal. Glass listened politely and ignored them. In mid-October, he departed the fort with a small group of French traders heading upriver. The company provided safety in numbers, though Glass's participation was tolerated more than welcomed. He remained withdrawn, speaking little, his focus fixed on the distant goal. The journey to Fort Henry on the Yellowstone was faster than the crawl, but no less brutal. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow and temperatures that dropped below zero. The party traveled by foot and occasional canoe, portaging around rapids, hunting for food, and enduring conditions that killed weaker men in other expeditions. Glass's body, still recovering from the mauling, struggled with the cold. The poorly healed throat wound affected his breathing in frigid air. The limp worsened in the snow, but he kept pace, driven by the same refusal that had carried him 200 miles on his elbows. They reached Fort Henry in late December. Glass walked into the compound and asked immediately for Fitzgerald and Bridger. The answer complicated everything. Bridger was there, working as a trapper under Henry's command. Fitzgerald was not. He had left weeks earlier, traveling east to join a military unit where enlistment offered better pay and legal protections unavailable to civilian trappers. Glass absorbed this information without visible reaction, then asked to see Bridger. The young man, informed that a ghost from his past had arrived, approached with dread so palpable that witnesses remembered it decades later. The confrontation was not violent. Glass stood before Bridger, examined him with a gaze that conveyed more than words could, and then asked a single question: why? Bridger, barely able to speak, offered the truth: fear. Fitzgerald had convinced him they were in danger, that staying longer meant death for both of them, that Glass was going to die regardless. Bridger admitted he had been wrong, that he lacked the courage to resist an older man's persuasion. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stood there, waiting for whatever judgment Glass would deliver. Glass looked at him for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice ruined but understandable. He told Bridger he was young and stupid, that youth deserved a margin of error that experience did not. He took back his rifle, the one Fitzgerald and Bridger had stolen, which Bridger still possessed, and then he turned away. The debt, at least with Bridger, was settled. But Fitzgerald remained. The man who had orchestrated the abandonment, who had taken Glass's possessions and reported his death with apparent indifference, was still alive somewhere on the frontier. Glass had not crawled 200 miles to leave the account half-balanced.
Hugh Glass left Fort Henry in early 1824 with one objective remaining. Fitzgerald had enlisted at Fort Atkinson, a military post on the Missouri River near present-day Omaha. The distance was over 500 miles, much of it through winter landscape and hostile territory. Glass, now 50 years old if contemporary estimates were accurate, had already survived what should have killed him twice. The journey to Fort Atkinson added a third, improbable chapter to a story that was already passing into legend among trappers and traders who heard fragments of it at various outposts. He traveled with another party, this time a group of trappers heading east for supplies. The winter of 1823-24 was severe, with deep snow and sustained cold that made every mile exhausting. Glass's body, pushed beyond reasonable limits repeatedly, began to fail in small ways. The limp became more pronounced. The scarred throat made breathing labored in cold air. He developed a persistent cough that suggested damage to his lungs or trachea. But he continued, because the alternative was abandoning the final piece of unfinished business that had sustained him through months of suffering. Fort Atkinson, when he reached it in late February, was a proper military installation with uniformed soldiers, organized command structures, and regulations that complicated civilian grievances. Glass requested a meeting with Fitzgerald. The request was granted, but with a condition. Fitzgerald was now a soldier in the United States Army. Harming him would constitute a criminal offense subject to military justice. Glass could speak to him. He could reclaim any stolen property. He could not exact physical revenge. The meeting occurred in the presence of fort officers, a fact that shaped its outcome decisively. Fitzgerald stood across from Glass, older and harder than Bridger, showing no remorse and minimal fear. He acknowledged taking the rifle and possessions, framing it as pragmatic decision-making under extreme circumstances. He did not apologize. The two men regarded each other with the accumulated weight of months and miles between them, a silence heavy with violence that could not be expressed. Glass took back his rifle for the second time, recovered his knife and possibles bag, and received from the fort commander a monetary payment intended to compensate for the abandonment. It was inadequate, symbolic, meaningless in the context of what had been endured. But it was the only justice the frontier and military law would provide. Glass accepted it, not because it satisfied him, but because continuing the pursuit would require killing a soldier, an act that would make him a fugitive and negate everything he had survived to achieve. He left Fort Atkinson in March of 1824, 17 months after the grizzly bear had torn open his body and two men had left him to die. The revenge he had imagined during the crawl, the violent reckoning that had sustained him through hunger and pain, did not occur. He had confronted both men. He had reclaimed his possessions. He had survived when survival was medically and practically impossible. But the story ended without the cathartic resolution that later retellings would invent. Hugh Glass returned to the fur trade. He continued working in the upper Missouri country for nearly a decade, trapping, hunting, and serving as a guide for various expeditions. His reputation grew not through self-promotion, but through the whispered accounts of other trappers who had met him, seen his scars, and heard fragments of his story. He spoke about it rarely and without embellishment. The facts required no exaggeration. In 1833, 10 years after the mauling, Hugh Glass was killed by Arikara warriors during an attack on a trapping party near the Yellowstone River. He was in his early 60s, ancient by frontier standards, still working in the wilderness that had nearly consumed him a decade earlier. His death was quick, unremarkable in the context of frontier violence, and entirely anticlimactic for a man who had survived the impossible. He was buried where he fell, in an unmarked grave that has never been located. No memorial marks the site. No museum preserves his belongings, most of which were lost or destroyed in subsequent years. What remains is the story itself, passed down through oral tradition, refined and embellished by subsequent generations until the truth became difficult to separate from legend. But the core facts are documented. A man was mauled by a grizzly bear. He was abandoned. He crawled 200 miles through hostile territory. He survived, and when offered the chance for violent revenge, he chose to walk away and continue living. That choice, repeated across months of unimaginable hardship, defines Hugh Glass more than any single act of endurance. He refused to die when dying was easier. He refused to become what his suffering might have justified, and he returned to the wilderness that had nearly killed him, not because he loved it, but because it was the only world he knew how to inhabit. If stories of human endurance, survival against impossible odds, and the complicated reality of frontier justice resonate with you, consider supporting this channel. Subscribe for more true accounts of resilience, the limits of the human spirit, and the stories history tried to forget.